Well, of course, all eyes will be on President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address this evening. And of course, the challenges are mammoth. Unemployment, poverty and inequality remain the greatest scourges facing the country. So what can we expect and what needs to be done? Well, to get some perspective on these and other issues, I'm joined by I Phelisa Nkomo. She's a development economist. Thanks very much, Phelisa, for joining us. Of course, being a development economist, you will be looking through the lens that seeks to find solutions to the scourges that we have in the country. The conversations that we've been having for the past couple of decades have really been the same. So what needs to be different in the State of the Nation address that speaks to these issues such that they're eliminated or eradicated partly?
Yeah. I think the first issue, Bomen, thank you so much to you and to the listeners. The first issue is that let's look at what the president had actually promised to the citizens in 2021. He said three things. I think the first issue, he said, I'm going to deal with vaccine equity. So we need to think about where are we? I mean, currently we're less than 40% of South Africans who are vaccinated, but also two is that the COVID pandemic presented a massive opportunity for upgrading of infrastructure, particularly public health infrastructure. If you look at the Eastern Cape infrastructure, for example, if you look at, in fact, the provinces that would be, kind of like classified as rural economies. So that's a massive opportunity to actually upgrade the infrastructure, but also profoundly as well as to create jobs. I think the second issue that the president had actually announced last year was the issue of dealing with the corruption. So he had presented in the last 6 weeks, he has presented SIU report and Zondo Commission report. So what we need to ask, because corruption creates a leakage in the economy. So South Africans need those resources. So there needs to be a very clear, a judicial process, but also those who have been implicated in terms of those reports should actually be brought to book to make it sure that, those resources are actually recovered. And then the third issue that he raised was quite clear, was to build a resilient economy and a sustainable economy. So the key question now is then to say that, I mean, we've been setting that with that promise for the last 12 months. And within the pandemic period, we've lost about 3 million jobs. The GDP growth is expected to be less than 2%. And we know that if GDP growth is expected to be less than actually 3%, it's not likely to create any new jobs. So several things that the president needs to actually undertake. I think the first one is to actually make it sure that he turns South Africa into a construction site. So president must actually give marching orders to the ministers who are responsible for public infrastructure in this country to make it sure that they start working. The transport sector, the rail, for example, infrastructure is actually in a dilapidating state, and that needs to be resolved, right? Because when the rail system works, it means that the poor get supported or subsidized so that through in a form of the transport cost. The second component is that the marching orders that the president must also give, it's around the structural issues in the economy. Now, one of the key things I want to quickly, and I'm not sure if you're going to ask me that question, then there's a whole issue around the basic income grant. In fact, we're in a crisis. The president has to provide safety nets to the poor. In fact, in the same way he has done with the COVID relief scheme. But we know, for example, that, $28 or $350 cannot sustain any family. In fact, a lot of people know that $350 gets spent within a day, and you're never going to be able to sustain households with $350. So the president has to announce a safety net for the poor, and that safety net has to be basic income grant. But the net effect of the basic income grant is that it compels government to actually articulate very clearly the structural transformation program that they have. Because one of the key issues around the income grant is that when the state provides the cash transfer to citizens, and the very same citizens will be spending the state resources to sectors of the economy that are monopolistically organized and oligopolistically organized. So in essence, while we're thinking that one hand we're stimulating the demand in the economy, but in fact, we're actually making the very 10% of the citizens in South Africa who are rich to actually even become much more richer. So, and that's why I'm saying that it's actually the net effect of the basic income grant, because then it compels the state to concomitantly trigger several other structural transformation issues. The first one is access to finance for small, medium enterprises, women and youth. For instance, statistics shows us that we have 77% of young people who are unemployed, who are not engaged, who are not leading a productive life, right? That's a social instability on its own, right? In fact, we've experienced social instability in South Africa through crime. The second component is to make it sure that the access to markets for women, in fact, for anyone who wants to actually get into business. And where there's an issue, the access to market is very important. It's linked to the point I was making earlier, that if you have oligopolistic organized sectors and companies that have monopolistic domination within the economy, it means that the very basic income grant that is given to the citizen will only benefit the supply side of the economy, but in fact the very people who needs to lead productive life and be restored in terms of their dignity will not be able to do that.
Phelisa,
and that's something
let me come in there and just ask you the question. You talk about that the basic income grant must be a basic minimum that is introduced. The actual quantum, whether it will be 350 or 624 rand or whatever it may be, I suppose that will yet be determined. But we have a problem in South Africa that we have a fairly high budget deficit, and we tend to borrow money not only to fund operations in the country, basic expenditure in the country, but also to pay debt as well. So we borrow money to also pay down our debt. So if we do go down this road, we're obviously going to need more resources, more money to be able to provide for a basic income grant that's going to be long term. Where should that come from? Should that come from more debt? Should there be a raise in taxes? Where should that happen? Or should there be a cut down on some of the other social expenditure that we make in terms of the police, hospitals, and so on and so forth? What's your response there?
Okay. Yes, public budgeting is about trade-offs, right? So you're not going to likely to get one department that's completely said, I'm satisfied with my own budget. So there are plethora of solutions that needs to be looked at. I think the first issue, for example, is that we need to fund industrial development in this country. For instance, if you look at our budgeting spend, right, as a percentage of GDP, the industrial development only gets less than 10%. Probably it's actually sitting at 7% or 6% to be exact. So already that gives you signals that actually we might be creating a citizenry of people who should be relying on social security. And it shouldn't be. In fact, ordinary citizens, people who come from working class communities, want to earn a decent living, lead a decent life, a productive life where they don't have to depend on social security system. And I think let's just clarify that component, because that's very clear, because that's very important, because a lot of people always assume that poor people or working class people actually want to get everything for free. That's one issue. Then the second issue, let me deal with the issue of borrowing. There is nothing wrong for any country to borrow, but what becomes an issue is where do you spend that funding to? So, for instance, what South African government has just done now is to, get the borrowing money from the World Bank. What we need to do as South African citizens, and in fact the president needs to do again tonight, is to articulate that funding from the World Bank must actually be spent on infrastructure. Because if you spend it on infrastructure or what you call on productive sectors of the economy, the multiplier effects are actually massive. Well, firstly, one is the job issue. The second one, it has to be the skills. But also the third one is that you also support the supply side of the economy. So in essence, but if you take the money and go and spend it on social security, then we'll find ourselves exactly into the same position in 5 years' time or even next year, right? So that's why I'm saying that actually there's nothing wrong with borrowing, but you need to know what to borrow for. And obviously there's a very clear argument from several economists who work in the capital markets who says, in fact, South Africa does not even need to borrow, but I don't even want to get into that conversation. But I think the third issue as well, fundamentally, is that there needs to be a shift within the budgeting. Amongst the key issues that I'm not saying we need to underfund, and I think, I would like the listeners to get me clear on this one, to not underfund the social policy pillar of our budgeting. because that's quite important. We need funding from healthcare perspective. We need funding, for example, for education sector. We need funding for, TVET, because young people need to be there. But at the same time, there needs to be a gradual shift between the social security, social policies cluster into the economic cluster, because that's when you'd know that in the next 5 to 10 years, actually you'd know that you're going to get young people who are quite productive. But as long as we think that funding social cluster to ease off pressure, it's actually, based on, it's part of what I call short-termism planning, but also at the same time, it also means that you're going to have citizens who are consistently born in poverty, but also at the same time trapped in chronic poverty, even when they are meant to be leading a productive life. So in essence, there's a plethora of solutions, but all it needs a political willingness. It needs a different attitude. It needs agility from the state to deliver what is actually, entailed in the constitution, because the state has a responsibility to make sure that it creates an equitable environment for citizens, but also part of it is that citizens are able to lead a productive life and they don't have to depend entirely on the social assistance system. And the state is able to make such changes.
Phelisa, thank you so much for your time there and just giving us your views on some of the things that you think that the president should say and do. That was Phelisa Nkomo. She's a